So yeah, but I was going to start off by saying, so dwelling on the past,
Yeah.
was the first part you're kind of alluding to there. I think it is important to dwell on the past. I mean, World War II obviously was such a significant and disastrous milestone for human history that there's something that it has to define the way that we operate today. Like it can't be something that we forget about, because we can't allow ourselves to fall back into that same trap again. So yeah, everything that we kind of talk about today does have to kind of resonate with, that is what could happen. That is what happens when the system collapses economically and politically. So we need to ensure that we continually work to keep it stable and keep it working for everyone. Well, not working for everyone is kind of a hard word to use, because it will never work for everyone, but kind of working for the majority, I guess. So, and then the part you're kind of talking about with technology, okay, in the past, if that, using the United States again as the example, they were able to use the technology of the time, which was the radio, and they were able to use that successfully as part of the political movement. So technology has always been there in terms of the newspaper. If you go back hundreds of years, was almost a technology that was used to communicate a message. And then you move to radio, then you move to television, then you move to social media, and technology has always been a part of politics. So that's not really anything new. It's not as if it's like a revolution. It's just a different kind of technology that we're using now. And in the future, the technology will change again, and social media won't even be the most important
there is one, you're absolutely right, but there is one crucial difference here that I need to make like point, and it's that now the technology is being wielded by individuals, by the people. Major power, right? You know, so that's where it's a bit different this time.
What do you mean wielded by the people?
Well, I mean, look at the power of the internet. You've got people who are being listened to who are neither intelligent nor professional in terms of their politics or science or religion, and yet they're becoming gurus for all these domains, and people are listening to them, and it's causing, you know, so it's kind of like a fragmentation, you know, that's a lot of power. Just if you can start a YouTube channel and you get a cult following and you got people committing suicide, you know, that's power now, that the technology is being wielded by this individual. And not only will this technology, well, so far it has been the technology where people can cause major damage, or good as well, of course, but in the future we're talking about genetic tampering, you know, which again is already, you can go and buy a genetic kit and fuck with your, you know, with DNA and that kind of stuff already.
Yeah. Okay. So the internet has allowed this kind of means of communication to be more instant and more widespread. But again, these kind of cult followings that have existed forever, almost like a religion. You went to a church in order to kind of,
but
and
they
you would
were
listen
sorry,
and conform.
you're right, but they were isolated though, right? I mean, now it's not isolated anymore, and that's why we have this whole era of fake news. I mean, you had fake news in the past, but at least you had competition that you know, that you could judge against. There's just this binary kind of system of information, whereas now it's just like just a vast amount of information, and there's no way to make sense of things. And so this sort of fake news thing is new, isn't it? And it's new maybe, but does it impact politics in a new way? That's where, you know,
definitely. Fake news is a huge problem, because now the reality of the truth is kind of lost. And the conversation now is so difficult, even as someone that studies politics, to actually listen to some people holding conversations that are just so empty in facts and truth. And it's just become this kind of reality show of opinion. People just talk about what they think, but rather than actually using substantial policies to back up their opinions. And it's kind of is losing. Politics always kind of has to be a profession and it has to uphold certain standards. And it's kind of like teaching. Could you imagine having a teacher who stops following a curriculum and just kind of starts going off on their own tangent all the time, and that becomes normal? No, teaching is a standard that should be upheld to, and so should politics. And the fake news crisis is kind of distorting a lot of conversations now across different societies about what we should be doing to actually improve things. And it's just become like this reality TV show almost. Sometimes you just kind of have all these people shouting about opinions, and no one really knows how to deal with it. That's the other problem. And also people don't really know the severity of it. A lot of research is kind of quite an under-researched area in terms of academia. We did a small course on fake news this year, and it is very under-researched. Academics don't actually know the impact of that it has on people, so that we can quite easily monitor fake news and see if a tweet, for example, contained false information. We're able to see how many people viewed that tweet in different places, but we don't actually know how many people do believe that tweet. Are we underestimating how clever people are to actually spot this information, or are we overestimating how clever people could be? So we don't really know how people interpret that information, which is the biggest problem. And fake news is kind of only really been a phenomena that's really took off over the past few years, I'd say. But I don't know. It's kind of one of those things that comes in waves. The fake news problem. Everyone was talking about it when Donald Trump was running for president in 2016, but it seems to be that the stories, that the conversation of fake news has faded away a little. Would you agree? I don't know if people are really talking about it as much.
Yeah, well, I think it's become kind of like a maxim or like a mantra where people just kind of say it, and it encompasses the entire conversation just with those two words. Oh yeah, fake news. And like people are just kind of like, they understand each other that way. So it might have been faded in terms of a conversation, but I think it's not faded in practical terms. I mean, in actuality, it's still a phenomenon, and people there's this issue of fake news going around all the time. But I mean, that kind of points to a very philosophical, if you don't know me by now, kind of concept that, do we really ever know truth? Do we really ever know what the reality of things between people? So we can debate that all day long, but I kind of want to know, first off, how much of a difference is there between North American politics and European politics? Like here, I feel a difference, but I can't really make a sense of how different things are, because you can still have a conversation here. Like I was sitting in a bar with a feminist one of the first weeks that I got here, and I was talking about how I disagree with sort of transitioning for kids, like a 3-year-old in hormone treatment. This isn't something you really would do in public in Canada right now. This is one of the ways that you kind of commit social suicide, maybe even career suicide. Whereas here, people are still willing to talk about it. You know what I mean? They're active politically. They still have this liberal idea that we should communicate. Is that the case in England? I mean, do you guys still have this power of being able to communicate, or do you get shut down?
Oh, I mean, here it's kind of, now it's probably the more difficult time to actually talk to people that have opposing views, because this country's been completely divided it's polarized between two different beliefs in how we should move forward as a country. Like the EU referendum has really divided this country. I think people don't realize the extent of that actually from outside, that you can talk to someone who, as I'm a passionate Remainer, but if I talk to a Brexiteer, it could really stifle the kind of conversation you have with them to the point that you don't really talk to them. Like, and I'm not exaggerating. Like, you could be talking to someone and you get to the point you're like, I don't really want to speak to this person anymore. And that's how bad it's got.
Yeah.
And in Scotland, that was Scotland's kind of went through that with the independence referendum. And you speak to people who are Scottish and who have lived here. Like, one of my friends said that she doesn't speak to members of her own family because of the independence referendum. So here, like, the idea of being able to have opinions and stuff and people being engaged in politics has increased a lot recently because of the conversation, but equally it's depending on who you talk to.
It kind of is, because like just a few weeks ago I was in Bavaria, and I go to this tent. It's kind of like a mini Oktoberfest. So I go to this tent and we're all standing on tables, drinking beer and all that. So I'm there with a friend, and outside she got into a discussion. She just kind of hammered, those beers are really big, and she was asking this guy for a smoke, and so we're sitting there rolling, because he was rolling tobacco that he had, and he was from South England, just this nice man, maybe middle-aged man, also plastered off his ass, and somehow they started talking about Brexit.
Oh God!
And my friends,
it's one thing you don't say here. You don't say the B word because it just opens all kind of worms.
But it's strange because here we are in Germany, and we have a French girl from France, right, and a British guy, and they're both in Germany, and they're both drunk. They're both talking about Brexit.
Yeah.
And it was like just really strange to me. I was like, holy shit, man! Like, because I come from a world where once in a while you meet an American. You guys talk about the politics, kind of laugh it off, and that's it. But mostly it's just in Canada, it's like this huge kind of, we don't even see a difference between Canadian and American politics. They're just kind of like, parallel, and it's just a big shit show. And then, whereas here you get people from all over with different political opinions, and they're all talking about the same thing. It's like, well, both of you guys live in Germany. Both of you guys love living here, and you're from different countries, and yet you're talking about another country's kind of like politics. It's like, why is this whole European kind of identity is interesting to me, whereas you can get so many countries and cultures to care about the politics of other countries within the union as if they were part of this kind of identitarian or identity group, I guess. I guess it's like a big social experiment.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of great. Like, next Thursday, for 3 or 4 days, me and millions of other people across Europe will be voting for the same parliament. I will be influencing the same parliament that someone in Germany or someone in Malta will be voting for. That's crazy when you think about it. There's 28 countries that will be holding elections for the same parliament.
Yeah, see,
it makes you feel that we are kind of a group of people because we are kind of making decisions together.
Yeah.
So the European identity is incredibly interesting. It was something that I was going to do for my dissertation, but I ended up shying away from it. But it's interesting because the European Union has been trying to foster this idea of European identity.
Yeah.
And I'm part of that as well. Like, I do genuinely sometimes feel that I'm more European. I could identify myself as being more European than British. And that's because I believe in the values of Europe, the European Union values of Europe, rather than the values of Great Britain. It's kind of strange. That's kind of, you're kind of moving beyond this state level now of identity, which is never really existed. Well, it's not existed in the near past. We've always had that idea of the state and the nation, and you rally behind your flag. But now it's moving above that. It's kind of now becoming a supranational level of identity, which is interesting.
Yeah, I'd have to say, I don't know, my history might be off, but it seems like it's the first time in history where you've got an entire continent of like a political affiliation that's democratic across an entire continent. I don't think that's ever existed before. I mean, it's always been just like, like a religious kind of autocracy, like the Persian Empire or something like that, where, yeah, you got a lot of these groups, or the Roman Empire, and they're all cohesive, but they're all cohesive, not democratically speaking, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I think it's a good thing. It's just think we're trying to globalize, we're trying to do peace and to figure things out. We're kind of upgrading the software to our hardware. Everything is being interconnected. How are we going to do that? Well, we need to find some kind of global identity. So on the one hand, I agree with that. But on the other hand, I don't know if I agree with democracy, just as it is, as a process.
Mm.
When you're talking about the on a scale of the entire planet, I have to stick with my man Socrates. It's kind of like really stupid to just give people who know nothing about politics and nothing about technology and science, and you just say, hey, you have an equal sort of say in what we do here. Like, just, it's kind of like giving your 3-year-old the wheel, just like, yeah, steer, go ahead, go for it, do what you want. It's like, yeah. So that's where I'm trying to define my own identity as kind of like an epistocratic democracy kind of idea that I want to go for, which we could talk about later. But where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you don't, so sometimes you have these conversations about participation and the questions that you put to people in democracy, and whether, is it insulting to say that some people aren't allowed to vote on certain issues because they might not be educated enough on that?
Oh, I think you're no, I don't. I think you're way too weak on that. I would go way further and say people wouldn't consider it insulting; they would consider it racist, because, of course, it's
Yeah.
racist, or it's bigotry, it's prejudice. That it's like everybody's equal, everybody has value. It's like, sure, when it comes to morality, sure, and maybe there is kind of like an equal say, or everybody has a right to their own values, but there's no fucking way that we're all the same in terms of intellectual ability or understanding, or this, it's just an illusion that paradoxically has come from this liberal idea that I'm trying to support, right? Like, the customer is always right, the voter knows best. It did,
Yeah.
but now it's a different story. We're talking about things that we can't comprehend, not even the best of us. So
Yeah, where do you draw the line though when you come to this kind of thing? Like, if you're kind of saying that some people, some people aren't educated enough to take certain decisions. Like, I won't be educated enough to take a decision on operating on a human being. Like, I don't know anything about medicine or healthcare, so. But I'm educated enough to probably take a political decision because I spent 5 years of my life and £50,000 learning that in more detail. But where do you draw the line on who can then participate in these conversations? What is the threshold?
Oh, well, participating in conversations as we're having
As
one
in like
right
voting,
now.
as in like voting in terms of
Yeah.
the democratic process. Like, where's the line drawn that some people can say, some people can have a say and some people can't? Because if you look at the idea of bringing it back to Brexit, a lot of people say, and at the time in 2015 when the referendum was being proposed, the opposition Labour Party said, we don't want a referendum because we believe this question is too complex to put to the people. And then you had the Conservative Party that wanted the referendum and obviously had the referendum. In hindsight, they were probably right. The question was too complex. Like, it's not a black and white issue to leave or remain. Like, it never was and never will be. I kind of forgot where I was going with that.
Well, yeah, you're basically trying to prod at the line, right? Where do you draw the line? Who has rights? And I think this is where an epistocratic democracy would come in handy, because on the one hand, I'm quite aware, and I would have disdain, even, it's a strong word, but in terms of academia to me is corrupt. And unfortunately, if you want to have a great democracy, you need your population to be very well educated. If we were well educated, if the world was a little bit more let's just say this: if people were a lot more concerned with, you know, their local MP, for example, rather than what the Kardashians are going to do next year on their show,
Hmm.
I would have more faith in the democracy. I'd be like, well, we're strong enough democratically because we are a well-educated population, but that's just not the case right now. So, um, how do we? So, with an epistocratic democracy, you're literally saying, okay, only the experts have a say. But it wouldn't be just only the experts. You can do it in tiers, right? You could say, for example, that people still, everybody has a vote, and
Hmm.
a percentage or some kind of influence, as it kind of informs those who do know what they're talking about, who have a say.
Hmm.
um, so, like, for example, if the minister of finance, for example, well, the only, I wouldn't want a politician running for that. What I would want is an economics guy, right? Like Jeremy
Hmm.
Rifkin or something, or Eric Weinstein. And so, I would get economists to run. It would be an epistocratic thing where they know it's their industry, and they run for that position, as opposed to there being a politicians uh,
Hmm.
to run. Because I think
Yeah.
it's an absurd thing. Most politicians, their background is law, and we think this is a
Yeah.
fit base for politics. It's not. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it should be a diverse background of politicians, and I think to be a politician should be a secondary sort of kind of career or basis of knowledge. It really should be secondary. Whereas right now it's the opposite.
Yeah.
People study and learn politics from a young age, and this is their job, and then they try to get informed on all these other kind of important issues like economics, global politics, whatever. It's like, well, you're not an economist, you're not a scientist, you're not a biologist, you don't know about agriculture, you know about how to play the political game, and you're going to make
Mm.
decisions about all these things. So I think we need to make it more epistocratic somehow, and that should at the same time stimulate academia to be less rigid and say, because again, now you have to talk about defining who it is that um, knows about economics, because you have people who
Mhm.
differ on both. The values are still, fundamentally the problem of values is still there, which is you can have a conservative view on economics, or you can have a liberal view. You can have a conservative view on agriculture, you can have a liberal view. So, I think if you had more people in politics who are epistocrats, I guess, just for lack of a better
Mhm.
term, who then I think you would stimulate academia out of this sort of like, here's what we know, here's what you should learn, here's the way things are, and you'd have a little bit more, generation of people who are more, let's say, um, I think academia would be more willing to be more free in thoughts, as it should be, because people will be motivated. Then they can see better avenues. They would directly have control over the politics of the country. If you're a student who's studying agriculture, your votes would go, and your support and your knowledge would go towards the political decisions of the country, because you're a lot closer to understanding what this economist is doing, that the one that's running for that position. You'd be a lot more involved, um, you know in that political process, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think like we are we have lost recently. I mean, especially in the UK, you have ministers that are in charge of departments that don't have a clue. You have like someone that's in charge of healthcare that's never, probably even had like an operation in their life or something. And we've we've moved now into this era of like career, obviously career politicians who come from university, study the theory of politics, understand that it is a game because it is a game, and then go straight into playing it rather than kind of having any real world experience. The
Mm.
one thing I would kind of say is that you are in danger sometimes of if you do give um, these positions of power to people that are experts,
Mm.
you do sometimes lose touch with reality a little bit.
Mm.
Like, I think if you were to put someone who is a billionaire in charge of business, would they really be making decisions that are in the best interests of the population?
Yeah,
I
kind of like
I
Trump.
don't,
Well,
yeah.
this is one of the weaknesses of the epistocratic model, right? But I go into depth a little bit more into having these interim politicians, right, where a decision is made, but that decision is still can't be made without there being links drawn. Like if the Minister of Health in Canada makes a decision, well, that has to go through a series of checks. That has to be run through the filters of the economics of it and the morality of it and all these other things. So that's why I'm thinking it's still democracy, because people still have to vote for that decision in Congress or in Parliament or whatever that system would be implemented on, right? So I don't know, but to add fuel to the fire, which makes things even crazier, is that talking about decisions is that we're already fucking with this really shitty system that's kind of like breaking down. Well, it's not shitty actually. You've kind of proven the point that it's not shitty, but we're at a dangerous kind of like area right now with the system. And on top of that, we're starting to use AI algorithms to make political decisions. I think Estonia is the first country to do it. They're doing it with like smaller things like parking fines and that kind of shit. But they're
Hmm.
AI algorithms making real world decisions as to who's going to get fined, who's going to have this problem or that problem.
Hmm.
So that's just another thing to kind of like think about. But before we getting, I don't think we should get into that too much. I wanted to ask you before we end, because I have to go soon. Is
Yeah, no worries.
how much like what lies ahead if the EU dissolves? That's what I wanted to know about. Because you guys, I think people underestimate in the world, especially in North America, because we're the center of the universe. We underestimate how much power the EU. I mean, you guys are the one continent that's actually trying to figure out how do we create a global community here and how do we
Yeah.
do this. So
Create a global community. The European Union is like a global, as you say, it's a community, but equally, it was kind of established and it's moved more into the direction of trying to compete in the world in terms of being up there with the USA and China. It's the second largest market after the USA, and the population size is about the same, and GDP is pretty much similar now. So the European Union as an entity competes with the United States of America, and obviously now you have China coming in. And I think people always kind of talk about the European Union as being this perfect idea that this is how it should remain, and if you don't like it, then we leave and you don't change it. I mean, the European Union has had three different names. It constantly has evolved and will evolve again into the future into something different. And we shouldn't shy away from the fact that we might not like certain things about it. And but that doesn't mean that you just jump ship. You can stay on the ship and you can steady the course that is going on. And ultimately, the European Union is probably the most successful peace project ever. I mean, Europe as a continent, apart from I'd say like maybe about 100 years in the 19th century, I think it um, was at war constantly with each other. It just came off the back of two major wars with each other, and went into this period of consistent peace. And now we almost see each other as one. We see each other as the same. I mean, that's pretty amazing when you think about it.
mhm.
I mean, people were pitted up against each other, and now they kind of see each other as living in one community. So to see the European Union potentially break apart would fragment that kind of um, effort to bring consensus to major issues. How would the continent of Europe have dealt with the migration crisis had we not had the European Union there? Italy and Greece being flooded with migrants constantly. Do you think they would have handled the situation in a completely different way had they not had the European Union there to come and step in and say, look, we'll assist you, we'll help with the redistribution of migrants, and we'll come together and work on that issue. The same with the economic crisis and the Eurozone problems, and kind of working together rather than working individually. I would worry that Europe could fall into that trap again, in the future, how if we didn't have that table that we could speak on. You know,
Mm.
the UK now will no longer, probably most likely no longer be at that table, and I think that's a big shame because we'll be excluded from those conversations. And what happens in the future if the United Kingdom is in a position where it needs assistance and we no longer have that kind of platform anymore, you know?
That's where I want to steer the conversation into dissolving the EU, because if you have a major power like the UK, you know, jumping ship, maybe we have another Arab Spring on our hands, but just on a whole lot bigger of a level, right? I mean, maybe next year it's another country, and you know, and then it just kind of dissolves that way, especially with this kind of you know, political polarization that we're seeing.
Yeah, I don't know. I think if you look at Eurosceptic movements across the continent and, well, European Union countries, the idea of leaving the European Union, a lot of them don't actually say that anymore. I mean, even Marine Le Pen, who constantly was threatening a referendum in France, now says no, remaining is the best thing. I think the UK has shown that it's not that land of flowers that everyone thinks it would be. You know, leaving the European Union will not solve all your problems, and it's extremely complex to distangle 40 years of integration. You know, it's like having a divorce and thinking overnight that you can just carry on with your life, because that's not possible. You know, you're going to have to take time to break the process apart. So I think people have realized, actually, you know, the European Union is the best thing. You had Hungary, you had France, you had Italy that had kind of Eurosceptic movements that were saying we should leave the European Union, and most of them now no longer say that. Mm-hmm. So there's been a movement that people have kind of went, okay, maybe this is the best thing, and just change from within rather than changing from the outside.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of people in the UK, I think that way now. They kind of think maybe staying in and reforming the European Union would have been maybe more beneficial than kind of being on the outside now, because we no longer have a say. And the European Union will go through a change. I mean, it's going to have a new president of the Council and Commission, and by the end of the year, so it's going to go through a new period, and it's going to have the European Parliament elections next week, and that will probably return a lot of different parties and MEPs. That means that it's going to have to reform, and we're probably entering that new era of reform now in Europe.
This is what's scary to me, though, because I'm thinking about, so that this is as of now, which is great news. What you're telling me, I think, makes sense, and I don't want to be an alarmist, but I do think about future scenarios and the likelihood of certain things, because the same people that I keep meeting, and you know, globalists, the same people that support, you know, inclusivity and blah blah blah, and you know, staying in the union and all this kind of stuff. They're the same people who are culturally kind of contradicting themselves, because politically they say, let's stay together, we need to be inclusive, but culturally they say, you know, you're not allowed to talk about this because you're white. You know, we shouldn't have a space program because we need to spend the money on saving planet Earth. And it's like, they're so contradictory. I don't even know where to begin, because to begin with, if you want to be inclusive, by definition, you should not divide people and say, here's the category you stay in, here's the category you stay in because of your color, race, creed, and all this. It's like, guys, I thought you should understand this, and they're not learning from the past. You know, this is the new generations, and they're not learning that the whole reason we have liberal values is to uphold the values that you want. And yet you're going against the values that you're trying to create. It's so contradictory. And at the same time, they don't even understand that, you know, if you want to globalize, if you want to have a system that works, because we are integrating and we have no choice, that you're going to need to use a capitalistic model to some degree, that you can't have this closed system of economics. It doesn't work. Whenever you want to integrate, kind of like upgrade to a new sort of form of integration, right? Like from a city state to you know, a country, kind of like what Germany went through, right, before you know, before World War II. You know, you need this sort of like expansion of economics. You need you know, and so we need to forge out into space, and also that's how you save planet Earth. They don't understand this. Like, it's very simple. How do you think we know and can track the weather and can try to like figure out what to do with climate change unless we're in space. We need space travel. We need to do this. But even if I were to say we should colonize Mars or mine asteroids, we need to do this because that just seems to be the overall trend or whatever, the patterns that correlate between integration of higher and higher systems of politics and integration. So this is the problem that I'm seeing. And in the future, all it takes is this huge kind of like a blow to humanity, like famines and like just global warming that's causing lots of problem, huge migration problems. Right now, we're talking about a few million people here and there. Just a few million people. It's a lot of people, but if in the grand scale, it's not that much. But just maybe, let's say, 6 million out of nowhere. That's probably way over the mark. Let's say 6 million people migration problem, right? And we're not there yet. Look at the problems we're dealing right now. That we're dealing with right now, just because of the 1 million Syrians that Germany, look at what's happened. So imagine if we have this huge blow where you do have 6, 7, 10 million people dying or migrating or whatever it is. You know what I mean? You're talking about the dissolution of the system that you're trying to create if you have these contradictory ideas. So, it leads me to my final question is how much has the left-right spectrum shifted in the last 20 years since the Cold War? Because that seems to be the last sort of marker between what's important, what's relevant, right? After the Cold War, that was like solidification of liberal values and the capitalism system, but balanced economy because we still have the social services and all that. That seems to be the last marker, right? Between the Cold War ending and now. So
yeah, I mean, it kind of touches on what we were talking about earlier with we're seeing the world right now as polarized is just because the center ground has kind of moved. But we still have the same. I was going to use the analogy of here in this country, we have the Labour Party right now, who's led by Jeremy Corbyn, and people saying that his politics are taking us back to the 60s, nationalisation and stuff like that. So these are still the same kind of arguments that we live in, like even before the Cold War. Yeah, we look at the Cold War as a marker because that was the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the left and the right and its ideals are the same as before the Cold War as they are now after the Cold War. The end of the Cold War didn't really substantially change the politics of the West. It just kind of got rid of that other system that people kind of feared. So I don't know. I think the left and the right divide that we live in now is just a repeat of a cycle that's existed and happened many a times before and will happen many a times again in the future.
Yeah, but I think maybe if we do a part 2 to this, I would want you to reconsider, because I mean, you've clearly established that it's not as big of an issue as we think it is because of all this noise in the air, right? That the political spectrum is polarized, but I think with the issues that I've brought up and the risks that are very real, there has to be some kind of shift of the entire spectrum to some degree. And I just wanted to, if you could think about for next time, if it did shift, how much did it shift and in what direction?
Since the Cold War.
Since the Cold War, like where are we really? Like, I mean, in the 90s, people were flipping houses in the, in the West, they're making great money. Everything was fine. You know what I mean? You had this big boom and development of stock markets and all this kind of shit since the 80s. So it was just kind of running at its peak between the 90s and early 2000s. And then boom, of course, the recession. So that seems to have been the height of stability is my childhood, really.
Yeah.
And now something is happening, and it just seems like it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel like we're back in the 90s necessarily. It feels like there is a little bit of a shift. Some of it could be because of the noise. Some of it has to be true. I want to know how much of it is noise, how much of it is true.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll never go back to the 90s. Like, with the economics of every year will never repeat what's happened in the past. Like it will always change, and it will always be something different. And the boom and bust cycle will exist, but what the boom is and what the bust is will change.
Yeah.
So yeah, like going back to the 90s, things were good. We'll get those good times again. Like the economy will naturally return to its boom. It won't be the same, but it will be good, and then it will also return back to the bust. And that's just a cycle of economics.
And that doesn't really shift the political spectrum all that much?
It does shift. Yeah, it definitely shifts. It 100% shifts the political spectrum. I mean, politics moves with economics, and the fallout. I will always say that the populist movements that we have across Western societies is because of the 2008 financial crisis. That's what I will always believe was the trigger. But once we're in the boom cycle of economics, I bet you that the political issues of that time will be very mundane and boring, and the system will be pretty stable, and we will have forgotten about all this kind of stuff that's going on now. And that I'm pretty certain that's what's going to happen. And then we'll have another recession, and then me and you could be here in 20 years' time doing a podcast thinking, oh my God, like society is collapsing around us because we've had a recession and political system isn't working, and we'll just have that same conversation again.
So, I guess you see politics as kind of like the secondary thing. It really runs off the economics. But again, that's why I go a deeper level and I think about the technology of it, and I realize can technology undermine the economics and the politics, or both, or whatever? They're all inextricably linked, and that's why I was thinking like, and as far as what you're saying, it kind of clarifies things. It doesn't seem like the political spectrum shifts. It seems like maybe it just widens. You know what I mean? Like there's more of a gradient, or more of a spectrum to the left and to the right than there would be before. And
I agree.
That's why if you look at it from that perspective, and that seems like it makes a lot more sense. And I'm not going to kind of vomit why it makes sense, but later, maybe in the next episode, we could talk about that. But that definitely does help in kind of in quelling this sort of idea that the world is just, going to shit.
Yeah. Everyone just needs to take a chill pill. It'll be okay. Like,
yeah, exactly.
I think we sometimes do over exaggerate the severity of, and it's okay. It is, there are issues and there are things that we have to deal with, but maybe it is over exaggerated the extent to that it's going to cause major problems. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I've been pessimistic.
No, but I mean, I think regardless of if it is truly dangerous and a nightmare scenario, you're not going to get over it by panicking.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's where that solid foundation of we've tried and tested it true. We got to continue with what we know to some degree. You can't just throw it all away and then try to find some new thing from scratch. So I think you've made that kind of clear in this conversation, which is great. We can leave that off on a high note.
Yeah. Just everyone, don't panic. It's all going to be okay.
Exactly.
Take the hippie approach to life.
Yeah, the hippie approach. Yeah, not the commie approach.
Yeah.
All right.